So yeah, I've been asked to speak about kind of the multiple crises which are kind of imposed on us by the context of the pandemic. And that's, both the fight for safe workplaces, but also organising around redundancies. And in many cases, it's just kind of product of what we already know, that in any crisis, the ruling class will always try to shift the costs onto us. But initially, this kind of opposition seems like a dilemma. It seems like, as we saw with the NEU and teachers, it feels like there's a pressure to accept unsafe workplaces in order to save jobs, or to accept a loss of jobs, a hit to the economy, as the cost of keeping people safe. And this is reinforced every single day on the news and by the government, who talk endlessly about the economic impact of lockdown and treat job losses as an inevitability. But obviously, as revolutionaries, we know there are always choices, and those choices are made by the ruling class in their interest. But organising can begin to open up possibilities for rejecting this opposition between safe jobs and having jobs at all. And ultimately, capitalists have always told us there's a trade-off between secure jobs and safe jobs. Long before the pandemic, people were sacked for raising health and safety concerns, especially in industries like construction. And what protections and legal protections, that kind of thing, we do have around health and safety have obviously taken a long fight and a long history of rejecting this false opposition to achieve. But really, the context of the pandemic just makes all of this more acute. But also, in many ways, the unique context of the pandemic makes it easier to organise around health and safety at work, since concerns are hard to dismiss, and in the middle of a public health emergency, workers' concerns over health and safety are necessarily also public. If people get coronavirus at work, they're more likely to pass it on to people outside of work. And so there's, in many ways, actually more opportunity to galvanise public support. So obviously, as Marxists, we know the law isn't on our side. But that being said, things that we do have in law, like the requirement for collective consultation over large-scale redundancies and statutory protections for health and safety reps, etc., can provide opportunities for organising, even in the least organised workplaces. So this is why it's still important to know what the law says. And as RS21 members, we have access to the Labour Research Department's publications, and I've found these absolutely essential for me whilst I've been organising. So, in my former workplace, as I'm now redundant, there's no trade union recognition. I worked at a very large health charity, which manages NHS contracts. And for those who don't know, charities in general are quite unorganised. A lot of the work is there's a lot of emotive pressure to kind of do the work unselfishly, because you're meant to be there out of the goodness of your heart. And the sector relies a lot on kind of patronage and networking, especially in the more senior management. And CEOs like to kind of, in this sector, like to sell their brand as being kind of uniquely altruistic people working for a good cause, etc., despite often earning eye-watering sums of money. And the workplace atmosphere is incredibly kind of effective. It's very neoliberal focus on well-being, but a real reluctance and often punishment for talking about workplace issues frankly and directly. And for the almost 2 years I worked there, I was looking for opportunities to organise around. And over time, from talking to colleagues at leaving dues and Christmas parties, as well as some lucky breaks, like meeting colleagues at pastime demos, or even having RS21 promoted in the workplace, which I hadn't known about, I managed to get in contact with about 3 to 6 people who are interested in helping to organise in the workplace. And to put this into context, there's about 500 workers in my office and about 2,000 nationally. So often kind of seeking out organising opportunities can seem quite fruitless, and it often feels like it doesn't really yield results. But nonetheless, it's often just about making use of whatever resources you have at your disposal. So in my old workplace, there's a company intranet, kind of internal social media platform, which I'd use periodically to raise things such as back in February, asking if we were testing our frontline staff when COVID first hit, etc. And usually this didn't yield many results. It just not much in terms of uptake, bar a few kind of likes on my comments, etc. But it did provide a kind of low risk means of testing the water and working out who might be sympathetic, getting myself recognised by sympathetic employees as someone they might talk to about workplace issues, and kind of saying who the primary kind of antagonists might be. And I also, around the school strike for climate, I managed to get together, I don't know, maybe 10 colleagues to hold up some signs in solidarity. So these kind of small things. But in late March, the charity announced that they'd be making around 200 redundancies, and furloughing around 400 employees. And I was told at the same time that my role was at risk of redundancy. And when I phoned Ian, because he offered to have a chat, and he kind of helped me transition from despondency to seeing this as an organising opportunity. But I could sing Ian's praises all day because he's been excellent. But to be honest, I think he'd probably just get annoyed by that. And I think I'd be placing undue expectations on Ian as an individual, because the important point to draw is kind of actually, it's just really important having someone to talk things through with, to bounce ideas off and to offer advice. And that's something we can all do for each other. And that's why it's so important that we have our trade union fractions in RS21. So for instance, in Unite, we've got a group of RS21 members in Unite where we're able to talk with, bounce ideas off each other and talk about internal union affairs. But this was where kind of, despite not feeling like it at the time, I realized that my unsuccessful efforts at agitating had still had an effect. One of my colleagues was really annoyed about the furlough letter that employees had been asked to sign, which threatened them with unpaid leave or redundancy if they didn't return the signed letter in 24 hours. And they got in touch with me to tell me that they joined Unite. And we had a phone call about how we could go about addressing what was wrong with how the employer was treating employees. And one of the things I noted, one of the main issues, was not being able to communicate easily with other employees without management supervision. And they came up with the idea of creating a WhatsApp group for all the furloughed employees, which could use without having to go through company systems. At the same time, I got in touch with my Unite branch to let them know about the proposed large-scale redundancies. And the first response I received was a really good lesson in the attitudes of the trade union bureaucracy. I was essentially told that since the workplace was unorganised, by which they meant that Unite had no recognition agreement, there was nothing they could do. They then spent kind of several paragraphs dedicated to lecturing me on the importance of organising in the workplace, meaning getting a recognition agreement. But after some back and forth, explaining that I saw these redundancies precisely an opportunity to organise, I managed to get the branch to send me the contact details of a handful of members. And I'd asked for these contact details countless times before, but to no avail. But I think presumably the prospect of large-scale redundancies did the trick this time. And from this, I was able to hold a very small initial members meeting and get myself and a colleague elected as reps. And this, I think, is also really important, even for comrades where we don't have union recognition in the workplace. That doesn't stop you organising as a union and still being recognised as reps by the union, if not by the workplace. And that gives you access to all sorts of support from the main union. And at these meetings, we were also able to kind of test our arguments. So we're able to have discussions about how senior management were always the best at interpreting and executing the charitable mission, and how often they made decisions based on interests which we as workers don't share. But as soon as I was told that I was at risk of redundancy as well, I worked hard to find out who would act as the employee representatives for the collective consultation. And I found out this was the charity's employee forum. And as luck would have it, they were recruiting. So I ran for that and got on unopposed. But one of the first things we did as union members were to respond to prospective redundancies, was to do a petition calling on the employer not to make anyone redundant whilst they could furlough them instead. And to distribute this petition, we used our WhatsApp groups and the company intranet, as well as kind of personal contacts, that kind of thing. And within a week, we got 120 signatures. But crucially, we also used the petition as a way of allowing people to leave their personal email addresses to remain in contact, reducing our reliance on the company systems. And using this email list, which we grew pretty much every week, I sent out a weekly email with updates on the redundancy consultations and issues we'd identified, as well as ways that the employer should have been doing things differently. And our union members also got together and produced two documents: a guide to collective consultation based on the ACAS guidelines and what employees should expect from it, and an FAQ on why you should join a union. And I attached both of these to every email each week. And I think the main thing that this email achieved was to give people, even outside the union, the confidence to raise things as they went through consultation themselves and pushed a lot of issues out of the shadows. And people were really appreciative of these emails. But also, since I was on the employee forum, I was also partial to all the information that was being shared with employee representatives, even if the employee forum itself was quite a toothless body. And obviously therefore how the consultation was being handled. And since I had access to the Labour Research Department booklets, I had an on-hand resource for identifying what was being done wrong, and often I was better informed in this than HR themselves. So we carried on this way for most of the consultation, responding to developments with petitions, etc., and held pretty much weekly union meetings. And by the end of the consultation, we had grown about 10 times as a union group. And if I had to guess, I'd say we're only a few months off recognition now. But what's also remarkable is just how much of a reaction we got from the employer. Despite the fact that we certainly weren't organising with anything like as much of the leverage as an established union in the workplace, the employer responded in an incredibly draconian way.
You have 5 minutes left, Will. Thanks.
And after I was accidentally copied into an email which said, Will poses a significant risk to the organisation, challenging his own consultation and mobilising others, I submitted a subject access request and discovered entire email chains between managers and HR talking about how they didn't want to run the risk of giving the union credence and discussing in detail how they're going to respond to each of our posts that we did as a union. And I think it goes to show how unused to organisation employers often are, but also how much more of a sense they have the power that their workers have than we sometimes do. But moving on to kind of the issue of health and safety. Incidentally, whilst I was on the employee forum, I soon realised the employee forum was what's called representatives employee safety. And representatives employee safety are essentially trade union health and safety reps, but in workplaces where you don't have a recognised union. And whilst they have far fewer rights and protections, they still have some. For instance, employers have to tell all employees who their representatives employee safety are, and they have to make sure they're adequately trained in health and safety law. And since I worked out my employer definitely hadn't done either of these things, I started raising this with my fellow employee forum reps. And the attitude I took to the employee forum was that I was there to communicate with employees through the consultation and to get information. And whilst there were likely to be some conscientious employees on the employee forum, it was also likely to include quite a few touts. So my strategy there was to try and explain things as clearly and as firmly as possible to all of the employee forum. And incidentally, the chair and management hated this because they wanted things to go as privately as possible. So after I started raising health and safety, it didn't take long before I was allowed to attend senior leadership meetings on back to work planning, basically to get me to shut up about it. And after I reported back from this meeting to employee reps and repeated my concerns about the employer not fulfilling legal requirements to consult employees over health and safety, I was suspended from the employee forum and my role as representative of employee safety pending disciplinary investigation. But again, when this happened, I asked for advice from the RS1 Unite fraction, and Jill George very helpfully suggested that my FTO, my full-time officer, could intervene on my behalf from the union. And he did, asking for this kangaroo court to cease action against me. But I mean, whilst this isn't a kind of feel-good story, I still lost my job and we didn't manage to prevent any redundancies. It is a lesson in how even in the most inopportune circumstances, you can still start to organise. And I've watched a lot of my work colleagues go from being pretty credulous and apolitical, being much more savvy, but also much more hopeful about the potential for organising. And we started talking about formalising a reps committee, linking up with reps and other charities, for instance, Comic Relief and RSPCA, and something at bureaucracy, and that's something that, the trade union bureaucracy can support with that. So we still need to engage with the union in that sense. And the more we connect with workers going through similar experiences, the better and the more of a movement we build. But also we kind of talked about opposing the fatalism of job cuts by strategizing about how we can campaign to save services. And, the despondency of job losses have been tempered with the growth in our membership, and colleagues are starting to think about long-term strategy. So we talked about how we can campaign against prevent in the workplace, for instance, and things which seemed impossible only a few months ago actually now seem like real possibilities. So I think the take-home points basically are, even in unorganised workplaces, there's so much you can do. And even if you can't see an immediate opportunity, the little things you can do are still worth doing. Since we're entering a period of crisis, even small monthly union meeting is building capacity and laying the ground for kind of future battles. But also, rely on your comrades in RS21. Just having that experience, having that comradeship is so important to support you through these things. And there's so many transferable lessons. And I think on that slightly more hopeful note, that probably leads quite well into thinking more about that long-term strategy and what Willie can probably talk about a little more.
Thank you.